a society is born stoic and it dies epicurean.
Yep.
Right. And these first world problems can only exist in the first world. That's why when I think about, here's another example, climate change, right? It's something that we in the West and Western Europe and the United States, we're hyper focused on. Right. And maybe we should be, okay? They don't care about the climate 100 years from now in sub-Saharan Africa. Right. They're not worried about it. So when we're talking about certain things like, oh, we don't want to, have any more gas, natural gas, or we don't want to have any more coal. What are we doing when we say that? Who are we sacrificing when we say that? Right. So I'm not going to tell a developing nation, hey, you know how we used natural gas and the infrastructure exists and how we burned coal and did all these things so we could thrive and be excellent. You can't do that. You know what I mean? So when we think about these problems, like big global problems, like climate change, I'm just going to stay on that. The best thing that you can do is get people as rich as possible as fast as possible. That's number one. Because you're not going to focus on, hey, I got to burn this dung to keep my house warm. You're not like, you know what? Maybe this has some environmental factors.
They don't really care about the coal if they're not going to.
Exactly. That's what's wild, dude. It's like, we can't just think about, okay, these are issues for us, so we have to apply this everywhere else on the world. It's like, maybe they need unique solutions. That's why I have a problem with like this whole World Economic Forum and like these big brains that are trying to basically move the global economy in a way. And it's like, it comes down to a conflict of visions, to quote Thomas Sowell. I believe that there is no one person or small group of people that can make decisions better than the people living in that circumstance. Does that make sense? So there is nobody that is smart enough that can do enough calculations to know exactly how to move an economy. And the evidence of that is the Soviet Union. How many people had to starve? Maoist China, how many people had to starve before we realized like, hey, central control, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So these problems in these developing nations, and I'm not an international specialist, obviously. We're just shooting the shit at this point. But this seems like the number one thing that you can do is allow these people to get as rich as possible as fast as possible.
I'm going to push back a little bit on what you said, right? I want to hear what your opinion is. So you can look at particular examples, right? So let's look at Singapore, Dubai, right? Very, very rich countries, right? Singapore in the 60s was a third world country. And then they had one particular leader who came into power, and he basically became a dictator because he was like, okay, like I'm gonna do what's best for this country. I know how to do it, and once I get to power, like once I like get to power, and then complete what I said about doing, like this country is gonna look different, right? And Singapore now it's not first world, it's like zeroth world.
It's
right?
like the top of the mountain.
Exactly, right? Like some people make analogies. They say, oh, like if you go from Singapore, like the US, the difference in the US and Singapore, even though the US is so developed, but the US looks like a third world country compared to like how Singapore is so laid out, right? But I think, well, and the reason I bring it up is I think naturally the developing world will just get better, right? But they need to be left alone. That's the thing, right? In a country, for instance, and here's where I push back on some. I mentioned already that the U.S. is like the land of opportunity here, right? But it's at the expense of a lot of countries. So you look at, for instance, the Israel-Hamas thing, right? That just happened, right? Let's talk about the Middle East. Look at Iran. They're always chanting death to America, that sort of thing. But it's not because they're just like they just woke up one day and were like, oh, we hate American movies, right? Like, no, it's in the 60s. Iran was a paradise. It was the, you just look at pictures. There were no religious, and this is something I asked myself a long time ago. I was like, I've never met an Iranian that's religious. Like it's like they're always such nice, like secular. It's Persia, the Persian Empire. Like what happened here? And then this was back in high school, and then I was talking to some professors, and they started like telling me exactly what happened and how the U.S. toppled they wanted the oil, like the British Petroleum, right? Iran wanted to nationalize its own oil, and they said, oh no, we're not going to let that happen. And they toppled the Shah, put their own guy in power. And this guy, this puppet, he was a CIA coup. This puppet basically crucified 300,000 people in the street. He has torture squads, that sort of thing. And so Iran was in like how do you live with that, right? So like, and then they said, hey, we're gonna turn to whoever who's the only people that can get these guys out, right? And it was the religious clerics, and now they just don't want to leave power, right?
Yeah.
So like there is on the one side we can sit across the ocean and say, hey, this developing country, listen, why are they like this? But then it doesn't affect us because we're so far away and there's ocean separated, right? The same thing in Latin America with Chile, right? For instance, Pinochet, like Lyndon B. Johnson was out here, like literally, he's been declassified. You can look this up. He was like, make the Chilean economy scream because they're not giving us the products we want, right? And make sure it doesn't come back to me, right? And they toppled that guy. He murdered hundreds of thousands. Like, and these are like clear. Colombia is another example, like, you know, the Panama situation. Like, but like, it's not, they're not developing because it's something fundamentally wrong with them. It's, if you're a country that is not powerful enough to like stand on your own, like India, like you don't go screw with India, right? But if you're Colombia, if you're Chile, whatever, and every 10 years some guy comes in, you have a president that's a little not super pro US, not super pro China, just like his own thing. Someone just come and fucks with them, right? Yeah. Of course, like how are they going to develop if that's constantly happening?
Yes,
right?
I agree with you. So and that's a fair pushback. And this is my response to that. You're right. The fact is that governments exist abroad, right? So you almost need your government to exist to basically have your back. I understand that for sure. In a perfect world, to be honest with you, in a very perfect world, we would all be like Switzerland, where it's like, we're not fighting foreign wars. We're like sticking with our own thing. We have a good economy. The unfortunate reality, living in the practical application of this, the unfortunate reality is that big countries bully small countries. It's just a fact. So sometimes these small countries have to do things to prevent the bullying. So what I would say, the practical application of something like that, you need just enough government, just enough to prevent interference from other government, but not so much that it stifles the economy. So for instance, like I don't see any system ever created to create more wealth and opportunity than a free market economy. I've never seen anything better than that. But you need to have some, and I hate it because I hate the state, but you need to have a state that's not going to just let Lyndon B. Johnson come like, hey, let's bury these guys. You know what I mean? That's the unfortunate reality is like, dude, there are, and I don't want to call the US a bad actor because I live here, dude, and it's afforded me a great lifestyle, bro. Like, but at the same time, like countries operate in their own interests, and we're gonna get deep now. That's why people are ambitious, right? And what a free market allows is for ambition to enrich everybody involved. Because for me to make a ton of money, for you to make a ton of money, you solved a problem. And I hope you get super wealthy, dude. I do. I love when people get wealthy, especially young dudes, especially first generation immigrant.
Of course.
You come here and get wealthy, bro. That's like a dream of mine for me to just continue to see that. But what you need to do is either have ambition be beneficial to all or have ambition counter ambition. And that's why I think—
What do you mean by ambition counter ambition?
So that's why we have separate but equal branches of government, because we know that we're not saints, bro. The people that want to get to the top are not typically the people you want to be at the top. The people who want the most power are probably the people you don't want to be in there, if we're being honest. But what our founding fathers realized is like, okay, look, we're never going to have saints in these positions, but what we can do is have three separate branches where ambition counters ambition, right? So it's like, this branch can't get too powerful because this branch will hold them in check, and so will this branch. So it's where you're basically pitting the ambition of all the parties involved so they can't just hammer us or aggregate too much power in one branch. So like, I think the presidency should be such that it doesn't matter who's in power, instead of the presidency being such that it doesn't matter who's in power. I know that doesn't make sense.
I see what you're trying to say.
So it's such a powerful position now. And dude, that's why I think we're all at each other's throats. Like worse than I've ever seen. It's crazy because it's like the federal government is so strong that it actually does impact when somebody votes. And it's wild how it's like that. So like if you vote for Biden and I vote for Trump, it actually does have an impact on our life. Yeah. Not a huge one, more like zoning and school boards and stuff have a massive impact. That's why it's wild that people don't participate as much, but it does have a significant impact on your life on who actually wins the presidency. So I think that creates a divide. I think it creates a structural divide in the country where it's like people are at each other's throats because the federal government is so strong that it really matters if you're a Democrat or Republican. Yep. It's crazy.
This is I won't consider this pushback. It's like a conversation. It's a conversation. It's very interesting, and I have some theories as to why. So, for instance, the U.S. model of government, like you're saying, like we have ideally, like from the founding fathers' perspective, it's a weak state, it's a weak central government, and people are kind of let free to do what they want as long as they don't go harming other people, right? Like that's the whole idea. It's really interesting to see historically how that originated. So, and I don't think it's a model that can be applied to other countries. So if you look at what types of democracy, right? The whole system of democracy, it can, in the US, it was able to work. One, because, we have Mexico and China, like relatively weak neighbors, and then fish on both, the other two sides, right? Yeah. So basically from the US, like if you think of it as a cul-de-sac, it was this cul-de-sac, like people were able to live there and then kind of go like what do they call, like manifest destiny, like, some settlers move, they find some house somewhere in the wilderness, they live there, little house on the prairie, they have their gun, occasionally some Native Americans like come around and, they might cause some trouble or, maybe some wild animals or something. Like that was the whole settler ethos, right?
Yes. And
the ideal for them was, hey, we don't want the central government interfering in our life because our life is good. There's plenty of resources around. Like, we there's some gold in the rivers. Like we want to take that, right? We want to, if you go look at Russia or China or the Middle East, you can't have a democracy. There's been studies run that what types of people, for instance, if Russia were to have a democracy and these three candidates were the options you had, who would the people pick democratically? They would pick the strongman. Like they would pick the guy with the Trumpish kind of tendencies, right? Or Putin-esque tendencies. And it's because Russia's a country with over thousands of years has been invaded so many times, right? There's always like whether it was the Mongols, whether it was, the Tartars basically, or whether it's the Japanese, whether there's always, Hitler, Napoleon, like, so essentially like anytime they're given a little bit of, rest, so to speak, and they can focus on domestic issues, 50 years, boom, like we got to face another foreign threat. We need a strong guy in power to, essential authority, right? So for them, in the perspective of Russia, China, they won't be democratic, right? They just, that mentality is like sewn into their ethos, right? Like we need some guy who can direct when the situation gets bad, right? And the same thing in other countries, in the Middle East, it's an even worse problem, right? So in that situation, democracy doesn't really, democracy doesn't really, and there's another aspect. So in the US, like as a structure, the US has always kind of followed the UK in like a sense of rules, like rule abiding society.
British common law,
exactly,
things like that, yes.
Right? You can even see it like, you if you're outside and you see a bunch of Americans like trying to get ice cream, whatever, they'll form a nice little line and then wait, right?
Yeah.
Germans won't do that, right? Like there's no lines. They're just gonna get right. South Americans won't do that, right? So democracy needs like an ecosystem that's very conducive for it to thrive, right? When you're in the Middle East and you got these fanatic groups, you got these religious, like ancient religious groups that want their place in power, but you can't just let them have a vote. Vote for. Of course, what's gonna happen, right? Like it's like a very specific set of. If you have a democracy, it has to be very tailored to that particular country, right? Yes. I'm just saying, like when you were making your comments on central government, I think it's a very valid use case for the US, but it's harder to see that working in a lot of other countries, if that makes sense.
Yes, there's two things that I would need to address with that. The first one is when I was in Switzerland. World-class hiking. It was beautiful. I loved it. The most surprising thing, though, were the cities. So I was in Geneva, Lucerne, Zurich. I was all over that country. I couldn't find a cigarette butt on the street. Not one. I couldn't find a single homeless person. Not one. You go down to Pittsburgh.
There's a lot of homeless people.
Dude, there's trash everywhere. You're tripping over people trying to get to the parking garage. So I thought, I'm like, what is the difference here? Why is it that like the cities here are safe? We're walking around at 8:30 at night trying to buy chocolate in a foreign land. And I never felt safer. There's kids out on a scooter. Like it's 8:30 at night. I would never let a kid out on a scooter in Pittsburgh at 8:30 at night. And it comes down to exactly what you're saying. There's a cultural difference. There's a geographical difference. And as a result of the geographical difference, there's a
the individualism aspect, right? The individual aspect, like you just mentioned, is great for companies. It's great for, I come here and I come to the US. I don't go to Switzerland to get rich, right? I come to the US and I'm like, hey, I'm going to take advantage of all the resources here. And then I'll go live in Switzerland, right? But like, that's like, they are way more, you know, what's collectivist, like in a sense, you know, they're not,
there's a pride there.
Exactly,
there's a pride there, dude, for sure. Like we were screwing up, throwing trash in the wrong can. This motherfucker comes up. He's like, no, we don't do it like this. Like real like pissed. And I'm like, I respect the shit out of that because in the city, you'll have somebody dump a bottle of liquor outside, shit on the sidewalk and keep walking. And everyone's like, that's normal. So, okay, this is, I agree with you. The American model doesn't necessarily have to work everywhere, and I don't think it can, right? I think there's cultural differences that are so involved in that individual that we think that we can just pick up the American system, drop it somewhere, and it's going to work. I don't believe that. That's why, and this is going to be a difficult, I hope I explain this right. That's why federalism in the United States made so much sense. Because there's a collection of different states where different people settled with different cultures that settled there. So some states might be worse off than other states in some respects, better off in other respects. So you had a medley of different states to choose from, right? So there was just enough federal government that, you know, I think eventually they instituted a common currency that made, you know, business a little bit easier. There was a...
You're talking in the US, right?
Yeah, in the US. Yeah. So there was there was enough federal government to hold those states together, but not as much that it didn't matter what state you lived in. So I don't necessarily think that the American model is going to work everywhere. The only thing that I can say definitively in the opinion that I hold is that each country is going to have a certain amount of government that allows that country to flourish. But I believe that it needs to be the minimal dose of government that still maximizes freedom. Because I do believe human freedom and economic freedom is the ¡1 way to create opportunity, to create products, to bring people out of $8,000 a year to, what's the average American make? Like 50 grand? Like it's like a
Even compared to Europe, that's like double.
Like it's like a 6x growth, dude. So I agree with you. The American model doesn't necessarily work everywhere. We tried it in Afghanistan, dude. That thing collapsed in a heartbeat. As soon as we left, it was like, done. No more American model. So it's not necessarily going to work. I just hope that, and this might be a pipe dream, I just hope that there's enough individuals in these countries to say, I want to use the minimal amount of government to preserve what I think is right, but maximize the opportunity here for us to actually get out of this situation. I have a buddy that's in the military. He's like, dude, I was in Afghanistan 3 different times. They're 300 years in the past. He's like, that's never, what we're trying to do there is never, ever going to work. He said that years before we ever pulled out. He's like, it's never going to work. I just would like to see, like when you look at China, right? There is nothing better for China than when they started to introduce more free market opportunities there. Now it's not free market, bro. Like make no mistake, you don't own anything there, but they use free market systems to allow people to get wealthy. Now the state can take your shit in a heartbeat. And I wish that weren't the case. And I feel bad for those billion people over there. But at the same time, they even recognize like, wait a second, we need to allow some free market principles in order for these people to actually get out of destitution. Like my goal with free market economics, yes, I want to make a shit pile of money, dude. You do too,
of
bro.
course.
That's why we do. We're ambitious guys. We're young guys. But more than just that, I really do believe that is the number one way to take people out of poverty. That's my personal opinion. That's just based off of what I've read.
To summarize what you're saying, like, and it makes sense. It's for any country. The model can be applied to any country. The specifics are what, are what's different, right? But basically, any country will thrive if there's a path to success for any citizen in that country, right? If any person in that country can come up with an idea and go, create their own business, that's giving back to the country. If that's something and get rich, right? Obviously,
yes.
If there's some hindrance there, that's where you see the problem. And then this is completely obvious in Colombia, in Brazil is actually a lot better, but Argentina, all these countries like India, that is very hard, right? There is no social mobility, right? The average person wants to be mobile. They want to have, maybe not everyone is gonna start a business and get rich, but at least like have, enough money to send your kids to a good school, to live normally, right? And that's something that these countries don't afford the average person, because there's so much corruption up top, right? So I'll use Colombia as an example. Colombia has a president. This is the case with a lot of countries, right? The most of the countries in the world. Colombia has a president right now. He's a bit on the left, right? And makes sense in Colombia because there's so many, like, socialism has a use case when there's so many poor people, right?
Yes.
Like you can't just be like, oh, capitalist, why are you guys so poor? You were born in the favela. Okay, screw you. Like, work your way up. No, they need some sort of help, right? In the past, I think it's the past 30 years, 3 Colombian presidents have been assassinated for trying to push more social reform. And the reality is, it's not because the people aren't assassinated. People love it. The people that actually rule the country, there's several families. There's like 5 or 6 families that actually rule Colombia. And this is the same with Peru, Ecuador. There's like, several, basically oligarchs, right? And you do something that screws with the money. Like one oligarch family will own all the media channels. Another oligarch will own all the produce. So like you see a supermarket, there's like 3 or 4 brands of supermarkets, all owned by the same family. You try to make your own supermarket chain. You try to make your own media channel, like do your own news. Get a bullet in the head, right? So that's the law behind the law, right? It's very hard for a government.
It's the deep state.
Exactly, right? It is exactly what it is, right? In the U.S., it's less obvious, but it's there, right? Mm-hmm. It's very hard for, like, Colombia will have a parliament. It has its Senate and its Congress and the bodies of government, but that's not really who controls things, right? Like, that's just a front to be like, okay, we're democratic. But if you do something that you actually want to change something, bad things are going to happen with you, right? So that series of it has to change. Like, all these countries, whether it's most countries in Latin America, the Middle East is another example, right? They're rich, but who controls all the oil, right? It's the family at the top, the Saud family in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yes.
It's not the regular people they might sprinkle a little dust, gold dust every once in a while, right? But all that oil is just in one family, right? That's so much wealth. How are you gonna? It's not like, oh, we don't have the governing body, we need votes. It's not that, right? Those people will not give up power easily, yes. Right? And if they will, it'll be a violent overthrow of power, which maybe should happen. But that's the blocker to a lot of developing countries to actually develop. If that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, because when the state is powerful, it can be co-opted and used in a way for the person who co-opted.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's why it's, again, I just think there needs to be enough state to safeguard certain inalienable rights, mm-hmm. and to safeguard against foreign invaders or foreign countries, or a country that can definitely take advantage of you.
Yep.
But not so much that it stifles that economic mobility, because like you said, the Saudi government is basically run by the wealthiest people. Kind of in our country too, man.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, not as blatant, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you can get these outsiders in, and there's a ton of economic mobility here, but I think you're right. There's like, it's what some people call the deep state, or the shadow government, or the oligarchy, whatever you want to call it, where it's like big money that co-opt the government, that basically put policies in place that allow them to stay on top.
Yep.
Bro, I mean, like, think about how much money like these big pharma puts into politics every year. You know, there's 2 countries that allow pharmaceutical companies to market directly to the consumer. We're one of them.
Yeah.
Bro, they're so powerful. Powerful as hell.
Speaking of you know, drugs and this sort of pharma, like look at the FDA. Like the food here in the US is the worst food in the world. It's like these canned, you know, the canned shit that you get at stores, boxed macaroni, like, you know, every drink juice, you could buy a bottle of juice, it has like 3 times the sugar intake, the normal sugar intake for a week for one person. These things are banned in Latin America. These things are banned in Europe. If you want to do even like if you want to get a yogurt or something healthy in you know, let's say you're in Colombia or in Brazil, whatever, there's like a big sticker on the yogurt and it'll say too much sugar, too much salt. Like it's big black like label, right?
Yeah.
Here it's just, you know, that's too little sugar. Like you gotta,
yeah,
you know what I mean? But the FDA, which is supposedly supposed to be you know, doing good for the consumer, right, is not doing anything. It's just clearly an instance of corruption, right?
Yes.
And Switzerland doesn't let in any of these any like probably like I'd say 50% or more of these food products that we consume here on a regular basis.
Definitely.
Banned.
Dude, and it was weird being in Switzerland. Like nobody was like jacked.
Yeah.
But nobody was fat except for the Americans.
Yeah.
Honest to God. Like I swear to God, we would be hiking or we'd be in a city or something. Yeah. And then you'd hear somebody like yell in English just because that's how we are as Americans. And he would be fat, bro. Yeah. Like that's just how it was. Like down in Rio de Janeiro too. Like I'm walking on the beach. I'm like, everybody's in shape. There's like Ipanema Beach. You're running across. I mean, it's just awesome. But then like there'd be like a fat guy and he would be American, bro. It's true.
I mean, the portion size is like here you can get a, you know, like a large burger you go to McDonald's in Brazil and a large burger is like between small and medium here. You know, that's the one that no one gets. Like everyone gets at least a medium, right? Yeah. So it's like what the obviously like people are gonna get fat, right?
Yeah.
Even shirt sizes, man. I was coming here like I'm depending on the shirt, like I'll usually be a medium, but here there's like medium, large, and then all these sizes that doesn't exist. It's like XL, XXXL.
Yeah,
that's Dude, really big.
That's when we were down in Rio de Janeiro. I remember we went to a restaurant. We had a guy that was our guide through Connection Rio. That's when I was training. I was fighting. We were down there. And we sat at the first restaurant. I was like, oh, dude, I'm starving. You know, it was a 9-hour flight or whatever it was. We sit down and I ask him like, hey, where's the burger? He tells me and I try to order it the best I can. Probably got ripped off, dude. Like they were just like, oh, that'll be 100 reais. Yeah. They bring the burger and I'm like, where's the rest of it? Yeah. It was just the burger. I'm like, I'm expecting a fountain drink, French fries, everything else, dude. It is totally different. That was another big culture shock when I go international. It's like, bro, I'm going to starve. You don't though.
Just get more burgers.
Yeah, exactly. Like I am going to starve.